China-U.S. relations and security concerns. They were a major focus of discussion at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Calebs and filling in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Welcome all. Asia's premier security summit, the Shangri-La Dialogue, wrapped up over the weekend in Singapore. Delegates from more than 40 nations heard from high-ranking officials, including China's defense minister and the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Major areas of discussion included Taiwan, regional peace and stability, and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We begin with this report from CGTN's Miro Liu.
Chinese State Councilor and National Minister for Defense General Wei Fenghe minced no words as he delivered his plenary speech on the last day of the Shangri-La Dialogue. The defense chief gave out one of the sternest warnings yet on Taiwan.
We will resolutely crush any attempt to pursue Taiwan independence. Let me make this clear. If anyone dares to secede Taiwan from China, we will not hesitate to fight. We will fight at all costs, and we will fight to the very end. No one should ever underestimate the resolve and the capabilities of the China's armed forces to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity.
General Wei's statements were a direct rebuttal of allegations made by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on Saturday. Secretary Austin had accused Beijing of having a coercive and aggressive approach to its territorial claims.
We see growing coercion from Beijing. We've witnessed a steady increase in provocative and destabilizing military activity near Taiwan.
General Wei also hit back at efforts led by Washington to unite nations under regional security groupings such as AUKUS and the Quad, which he said were aimed to contain China and reflected a Cold War mentality.
To us, the strategy is an attempt to build an exclusive small group in the name of a free and open Indo-Pacific, to hijack countries in our region and target one specific country. It is a strategy to create conflict and confrontation, to contain and encircle others.
Apart from the public engagement, General Wei Fenghe met his counterparts from Singapore, Republic of Korea, the United States, Japan, and Australia on the sidelines of the 2022 Shangri-La Dialogue. Amongst these, the bilateral meetings with the United States and Australia were held for the first time in 3 years. Miro Liu, CGTN, Singapore.
Time now to join our panel. And joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is chair professor at Soochow University. And with us from Philadelphia, Nason Mahboubi. He is a research scholar at the Center for Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. Also joining the discussion, Joseph Gregory Mahoney. He is professor of politics and international relations at East China Normal University in Shanghai. And here in Washington, joining us is Saurabh Gupta. He is a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Analyst at the Institute for China-American Studies. Gentlemen, all, thank you very much for joining us. And Victor, I want to start with you in that very fine setup story we just had from Miro Liu. We have heard Chinese officials use very strong terms in the past, talking about their passion for Taiwan and how that is going to maintain the one China policy. They have said time and again they are going to dig their heels in, not give up 1 centimeter. How do you react to the very strong rhetoric coming from the Minister of Defense?
Thank you very much for having me. I think General Wei's remarks in Shangri-La Dialogue is very important. However, it is typically in line with the Chinese position, not of today, but ever since 1949, mainly because the issue of Taiwan is really an overhang of the unfinished civil war, which brought to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in China's mainland in 1949, and the fleeing from China's mainland to Taiwan by the nationalist government at that time. So ever since 1949, the civil war literally has never been finished. And China's position has always been to liberate Taiwan by force if it is necessary, but since the beginning of the 1980s, to promote the prospect of the peaceful reunification. Under whatever scenario, there will be zero tolerance of the so-called Taiwan independence or the secession of Taiwan from China. All the countries in the world recognize there is only one China, and Taiwan is part of China, including the United States. So the United States really is adopting a position of not only ambiguity, but contradiction and self-imposed misleading of the American people and the people in the world, all the countries in the world, as if, for example, Taiwan versus China's mainland are two separate countries. Nothing is far from the truth. And the position of the Chinese People's Liberation Army is to liberate Taiwan, if necessary, by force. And of course, we want to achieve the reunification by peaceful means. That's our preference.
And Joseph, to build on that ambiguity that we heard Victor talk about, let me go back to what the U.S. Defense Secretary said, and I'm going to read this quote to make sure I get it right, accusing China of provocative military activity near Taiwan. Joseph, I want to get your take on that. What do you think about that, and does that add to the ambiguity, and why would the Defense Secretary from the United States make that statement at such an important time? Do you see anything like that going on right now?
Well, we do know that recently, I think it was on June 1st, if I remember the date correctly, China did openly conduct combat readiness patrols around Taiwan in response to comments that had been made by Joe Biden when he was in Japan, or around about that time, about the United States resolve to intervene in a military conflict, eroding the old rubric of strategic ambiguity that Professor Gao was talking about. You know, to add something to what Professor Gao says, indeed, it's true. China has always taken this position. It's not something really new. But what is new, of course, is that China is becoming a power to be reckoned with, both in Asia but globally. And what we have now, of course, is this terrible 2 or 3 years with the pandemic and the conflict with Ukraine that have made everyone a little more serious and listening perhaps to China and watching China more than before. So although China's been saying it for decades, I think people are only really listening to it now and making hay of it.
And Nathan, if I can bring you into the conversation, please, because this is also part of the Asian pivot, if you will, that really began back during the Obama administration. And China's defense minister says it's going to be up to the United States to improve the bilateral relationship with China. What do you think the U.S. reaction is to these strong opinions that were voiced in a very emphatic way?
You know, I think the Taiwan issue is a very difficult one. I think on both sides, there's been a ratcheting up of rhetoric and some actions. And I think for the relationship and for global order generally, it would behoove us all to get back to where we were in terms of the status quo vis-a-vis Taiwan for the past 40 years that have served us all so well. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg, you know, which side is provoking the other. And at this point, it's kind of circular, so it's almost hard to figure that out. But there's no question that both sides have done various things that then the other side feels that they have to respond to. And I'm sure that Minister Wei felt a little bit of pressure, given the overall landscape, to add a little mustard to his comments at the forum, at the dialogue. But you know, I also think that there is clearly a move afoot to stabilize the relationship. We know that Jake Sullivan and Yang Jiechi met again today for 4.5 hours in Luxembourg. So I'm not sure that I would put too much stock on you know, the comments of Minister Wei, or for that matter, the speech from Defense Secretary Austin, really moving us to a new place in the relationship. I think that's sort of par for the course, but the ongoing dialogues do seem to be ratcheting things down a little bit, and I'm hopeful that it will continue to go in that direction.
Sir, what do you think about that? Is it bringing the situation down a bit? Because quoting the New York Times, talking about the two defense ministers, it said the two men have played out in miniature the tensions between Beijing and Washington over disputes across Asia, especially Taiwan. Is that a fair assessment of the position taken by China's defense minister at this Shangri-La summit?
Yes, up to a point. We have to step back and understand that Shangri-La is happening for the first time in 3 years. And so there is added focus on the dialogue. In the interim, there have been a lot of actions, particularly from the US side, in hollowing out the One China policy, particularly the aspect of strategic ambiguity. And therefore, at the first major conference occasion, I think it behooved the Chinese defense minister to come out with a firm stance on the Taiwan issue. For the US side too, I think it was important for them to mention Taiwan simply because of the awful actions that have been taken in Ukraine by Mr. Putin. And therefore, I mean, the rules-based order is under a form of jeopardy, and therefore Taiwan necessarily came to the fore, even though Taiwan and the Ukraine situation are miles apart in many respects. And so, yes, there was these were drivers at the back which needed the two defense ministers to speak up, because I mean, if both sides reinforce deterrence, there's a fair chance that if it is managed well, that a stable equilibrium could be built. But I would add in this regard to, and this is, I would say, this is slightly different from what Mr. Gao had characterized the US position on Taiwan. This is where the instability is. The US position is that we acknowledge the Chinese position that there's one China, but we do not endorse it. And very dangerously, in this last month in May of 2022, that part of the verbiage has even been dropped. That had been there since 1971 when Kissinger wrote the Shanghai Communique, that we acknowledge the Chinese position, although we do not endorse it necessarily, which has been the US position since 1951. And here we are 50 years later, the US surreptitiously and quietly dropping that part to suggest that this might not necessarily be an intra-Chinese civil war, but a larger issue of peace, international peace and security, and that qualitatively changes the dynamics of the issue, frankly.
Victor, I want to go back to you, A, get some reaction to that, and B, talking about the instability and also the way the United States may or may not be looking at Taiwan. I'm curious to get your take on it. But I also want to mention something that Nathan said as well, because it's very important, this meeting that took place between Yang Jiechi and Jake Sullivan, of course, the two leading diplomatic officials, one a national security advisor for the U.S. and one a senior diplomat. And they did meet and did talk about Taiwan. And of course, President Xi and President Biden had that virtual conference at the same time and seemed to signal that they were on the same page about Taiwan. What are your reactions to the way Surab is placing this?
Thank you very much. I think the more dialogues, especially behind the scene at the very top level between China and the United States, the better it will be for China and the United States. Now, as far as Taiwan is concerned, the United States is not God. The United States is not in a position to change the fact that there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China. No country in the world can change that fact. Now, what General Wei said in Shangri-La spells out the future roadmap very clearly. If the United States wants to push the tensions across the Taiwan Strait one more step further beyond the point of no return, then the People's Liberation Army will have no other choice but to take military action against that, to prevent the independence of Taiwan and to defeat all those forces, both in Taiwan as well as in foreign countries which want to promote the Taiwanese independence. Now, I don't think anyone can be clearer and more well-defined as General Wei when he said that in Shangri-La. If any decision maker in Washington still pretend that they do not know what's the Chinese roadmap as far as Taiwan independence is concerned, wake up and listen up. It's exactly the same as what China said to the United States before they pushed beyond parallel 38 in Korea in 1950. If you keep pushing, then China will strike back. And don't wait until that happens and say, well, I didn't anticipate that. I didn't anticipate that China will take actions. General Wei is not making that remark on behalf of himself. He said that in his capacity as the state councilor and the defense minister of China. Right. He said that on behalf of the Chinese People's Liberation Army and the Chinese government. And wake up, the 1.4 billion people in China, including both sides of the Taiwan Strait. Wake up. This is really a very serious message. Don't push beyond the point of no return.
You know, Nathan, I have this monitor where I can see all four of you, and I was watching, because pretty strong words by Victor. I've known him for quite a time, and I haven't seen him get worked up a lot. You guys all have great poker faces, but I'm curious about your take on what Victor just said. And China has hit back by the U.S. efforts to unite nations under regional security groupings. I want to kind of look at how Quad and AUKUS play into this as well. And are these, what China has maintained, just kind of Cold War entities that could crop up again?
Sure. No, I'm grateful for that. You know, I think the first thing I want to emphasize is that any kind of military confrontation over Taiwan is going to be a catastrophe for the Taiwanese people, first and foremost, and then it will be a catastrophe for China and for the U.S. and for global order. So I think anyone should be doing everything we can to ratchet down tensions, ratchet down the rhetoric. It would be a catastrophe for all of us, for everyone on the planet, if anything were to happen vis-a-vis Taiwan. So that's point one. The second point I want to make is that I do think some of the tone of Minister Wei is reflective of the way in which the U.S. has engaged in some of these coalition buildings in the region, whether it's AUKUS, whether it's the Quad. And I think, you know, to be fair, they seem to, you know, be reacting, the Chinese seem to be reacting to some real pressure that the U.S. is bringing to bear through those arrangements. And I can understand how that would provoke a reaction. If I were to put myself in the place of, you know, Chinese leaders on these issues, I think what I would do if I was in that position would be to look for the vulnerability of the U.S. approach, which has more to do with the economic side of things. I think the U.S. has not done as good of a job as it ought to, and perhaps as China is doing, in promoting regional economic integration. And I think that message would be very well received by many of the nations in that region. So I think that is a weakness of the U.S. approach that the Chinese could very easily exploit. But I do understand that the military side of it, the U.S. has done a relatively good job under the Biden administration, and I can understand why that would provoke a reaction of the nature that we saw from Minister Wei.
You know, Joseph, it's interesting because China has been very good about building these economic ties throughout Asia, while the United States, the last 4 years, especially under the Trump administration, basically circled the wagons, saying America's first. But I want to get back to the Quad and AUKUS. China's defense minister saying that this strategy basically is just going to promote conflict and basically tempt trouble. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm gonna make a quick remark on Professor Gao's position. You know, I remember after it was announced that Biden had indeed won the election, Victor and I were on a television show with CGTN, and we were both very optimistic. We might even say irrationally optimistic, given what's happened in the past 2 years. That it was only sensible that the U.S. would find some way to improve the relationship after the disastrous 4 years of Trump, both in terms of the U.S. instigated trade war and the demonization of China because of COVID, and the failed COVID containment in the United States. So, you know, since Biden has taken office, we have seen AUKUS, which I really think we have to characterize properly as the proliferation of nuclear weapons. I see nuclear submarines as nuclear weapons. Maybe not everyone agrees with me. To Australia, the promise to upgrade the missile defense system in South Korea, the commitment to support Japan building counter-strike capabilities with its military. Japan taking a much more vocal role, parroting the United States on Taiwan. All of these issues, I think, you know, we can look very optimistically to say, well, there was a meeting in Luxembourg, there was, you know, this meeting in Shanghai between defense ministers. They haven't met in several years. They only first spoke, these two gentlemen, in April. And we can look at this and go, well, maybe this is a positive step forward. Maybe this is management. But in fact, I think every step forward it should not obscure the fact that we're taking.
Yep, we're having a little bit of difficulty there. We hope to get back to Joseph in just a moment. But, Saurabh, I kind of want to switch gears because I think we're all picking up on what he was talking about and the fact that these two military leaders did basically have this face-to-face discussion. How important is that given this time of conflict? And I also want to ask you to kind of think out of the box a bit. What do other nations in other parts of Asia think about this rhetoric between the United States and China, especially when it gets this heated?
First, let me come to the point of what the other countries think. The countries which have firm alliance guarantees from the United States welcome this sort of rhetoric because it helps them, allows them to feel more assured that the US has its back. For partners and other unaligned countries in Asia, which is the majority of countries, this sort of heated talk actually draws fears and anxieties because they feel that there might be a breakdown in order. And if there's a breakdown in order, either the countries, they will have to choose one of the two countries, or just overall the equilibrium will be so negative that it would be damaging for their future prospects. So that's how they look at it. With regard to the defense ministers meeting, I think it's of course a great thing. They need to talk more, and communication is always good. We have to understand that during the whole first year, the Biden administration actually was not wanting to speak with the Chinese defense minister. They wanted to speak to his superior, which was the vice chairman of the Central Military Commission. And the Chinese side shut that down, and the United States came to terms with the fact that, okay, we are on a protocol-to-protocol basis. It's going to be defense minister to defense minister, and we'll have the conversation. And frankly, it's a good thing because the more conversations are there, the more stability is there. And if the relationship improves, they can have greater confidence-building measures. We have to remember the two periods when we've had confidence-building measures, actual agreements, were in 1998, the MMCA, and in 2014, 2015, which was about the air and sea encounters. These confidence-building measures happen only at times when the relationship was stabilized. So we should hope for a stabilization of the relationship. But I think it says something to the state of US-China relations that if the defense ministers are at the front having the best communication among various US-Chinese interlocutors, that speaks rather poorly of where US and China are in terms of their relationship management from an overall political perspective.
I want to switch gears in 1 second, but at the risk of stirring passion in Victor one more time, I want to ask him about about what General Wei also said in his speech, that it was, quote, a historical and strategic mistake for the United States to treat China as an adversary, and calls on Washington to stop, quote, attacking and smearing China. Your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much. I will speak in a very composed manner, so don't be alarmed.
Okay.
I think General Wei, again, is making the truth, telling the truth to the whole world. Why? Because China is not an enemy of the United States, and the Chinese people are not enemies of the American people. Now, if decision makers in Washington get this wrong, this probably will be their biggest mistake in their history ever since the founding of the United States of America. So wake up and deal with China as it is, which is peaceful, which is constructive, which is building rather than destroying, which is promoting peace and promoting stability in all parts of the world, rather than warmongering, for example. So I hope General Wei's remarks, again, will be well taken in Washington. And personally, I hope China-U.S. relations will calm down significantly so that Beijing will welcome the visit of Lloyd Austin as the incumbent Secretary of Defense. I used to work for Deng Xiaoping when he met with the then incumbent Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger in the 1980s. That was a highlight of China-U.S. relations. I hope we will get another highlight by welcoming Austin in Beijing soon, and then by welcoming President Biden on a state visit to China very soon.
I want to switch gears because you talked about promoting peace. I'm going to talk about an area of the world that obviously is going through some horrific fighting right now. And we know that President Zelensky did address the dialogue virtually. Here's what he had to say about what's going on.
If due to Russian blockades we are unable to export our foodstuffs, which is so sorely missing in global markets, the world will face an acute and severe food crisis and famine. Famine in many countries of Asia and Africa. The shortage of foodstuffs will certainly lead to political chaos, which can result in the falling of many governments and the ousting of many politicians.
You know, Joseph, I've heard so many leaders around the world talk about that, and I apologize for getting so late in the show to bring this up. But your thought as this conflict drags on about the warnings from Zelensky, the food crisis and famine about so many nations, and of course many of those are the poorest nations on earth.
Indeed, it's a catastrophe that's unfolding, and you know, it's unfortunate that we seem unable to really take it seriously. But I think we have to take Zelensky's comments and pair them with those of Fiji's defense minister, who I think had the most poignant thing to say at the meeting in Shangri-La. He says, you know, the single greatest threat to our existence is climate change. And I have to wonder, personally, and my analysis, to what extent is the crisis in Ukraine part of an endgame for climate change? Russia has the most to gain from climate change. To what extent are countries now positioning for the general failure that we've seen over the last several decades and even the last several years when we've been talking about it but haven't done much to reverse it? So I think that there are, you know, we have this serious issue of inflation and the fact that we're not getting enough food to the market, and that we're going to have this instability in countries that are most vulnerable. But there's also this other looming issue, and I think we keep getting distracted from it and further away from dealing with it.
Nason, you have about 45 seconds. Tell me your thoughts on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. To what degree is that having a negative impact on U.S.-China relations?
All I'll say is that, you know, the U.S.-China relationship has its own internal dynamics, of course, but this conflict has been an exogenous variable, and I am relatively heartened by the way in which the relationship has not deteriorated too much because of it. But of course, the worry is, what if the conflict drags on? We don't know what that would look like.
Okay.
Up to this point, the two countries seem to be more or less on the same page. But if the conflict drags on for a long time, then it creates some new risks.
Indeed. Nason, I want to thank you and everybody else in our panel today. It has been a wonderful discussion. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks so much for watching. I'm Sean Caleb, sitting in for Anand Naidu today.